From Chicago's Can TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on Can TV. I'm Ken Davis, welcoming you back for another week. We like to sit here and talk about the important issues that are going on in Chicago and around Chicago, and today will be no exception to that, because if you live in one of Chicago's highly segregated neighborhoods, you already know you have fewer opportunities, fewer jobs, fewer high-quality schools, perhaps a lot more crime where you live. We've all heard these things before, of course, over and over, but sometimes an organization will step back, take the time to study these intangible things, really study them, and then put solid facts and statistics down on the record. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about today, because the Metropolitan Planning Council has been doing a lot of that lately, especially since Alden Loury came on board as Director of Research and Evaluation. It turns out residents of our metro area could earn at least $4.5 billion more in annual income if our neighborhoods and our suburbs weren't so racially segregated. And maybe if we didn't all live in fear of the street violence that's choking out our city, we wouldn't be in such a hurry to move somewhere else. And by the way, what happens to jobs in a suburb when many of the white people move out? And also, what about the police department? We got a lot of things about the police department and what happens when you are associated by guilt or guilt by association or something like that. Alden Loury is joining us. Hasn't been here for a long time. Glad to have you back, Alden. And also the author of that guilt by association piece in the Sun-Times, Mr. Mick Dumke, is here with us today. Glad to have you both here today.
Thanks, Ken.
Asked you to be on the show because although the things that you have both worked on and written are different, they are so linked at the heart, because one of our favorite things we like to say here on the show is that there is really only one map of Chicago. It's that heat map, that dot map that everybody is so familiar with. It looks like this up on the northwest and the southwest and on the west, and we've all seen it. And it is the map of segregation of Chicago and everything that's related to that. So, Alden, your organization prepared this report, as I said, called The Cost of Segregation. You compared us to the 100 largest metros in the country, and we don't look that great, I guess.
No, not by the measures included in the report. The Urban Institute did the heavy lifting on the analysis here. Essentially what they did was they looked at the 100 largest metros in the nation. They measured segregation in three ways: economic segregation, black-white segregation, and Latino-white segregation. And then they did a multivariate regression analysis to find out if there were strong relationships between those measurements of segregation and the number of quality of life indicators, including per capita income, household income, life expectancy, homicides, and I'm missing one, educational attainment in terms of bachelor's degrees. And what they found was that there were statistically significant relationships between per capita income and in the form of black per capita income with black-white segregation and economic segregation. They also found a statistically significant link between homicides and black-white segregation. And finally, they found a statistically significant link between black-white segregation and bachelor's degree attainment, particularly for African Americans and for whites. And so when trying to determine what the cost is of that segregation in the Chicago region, what the Urban Institute did was they took a look at where Chicago ranked in those measurements. We were 20th out of 100 in terms of economic segregation and 10th out of 100 in terms of black-white segregation. If we were at the median level, essentially between 50 and 51, what would those indicators look like? And by and large, black income is higher in places where the level of black-white segregation is at the median, or where economic segregation is at the median. There are fewer homicides, and there is greater bachelor's degree attainment for African Americans and whites.
So what you did was you said, okay, here's the numbers as they exist. Somewhere out here there's the median. We're kind of nowhere near it. But if we could just snap our fingers and move Chicago to the median, how different would we as a city be?
Right, based on what characteristics they see of those regions that are at the median. And what those numbers show is $4.4 billion in additional black income, per capita income per year. 30% fewer homicides, and 83,000 more bachelor's degrees, 78% of which would be attained by whites, the remaining 22% by African Americans, and that would be over a 10-year period. So if we were at the median in terms of our black-white segregation in 2000, by 2010, we would have had 83,000 more people with bachelor's degrees based on the percentages of African Americans and the percentage of whites with bachelor's degrees in regions that are at the median or near the median. So, you know, that's a significant cost. And what we did is we added to Urban's research by determining what $4.4 billion in additional income would mean for the region in terms of GDP. It's an additional $8 billion by our calculations. That 30% reduction in homicides means close to $70 million $170 million in additional annual lifetime earnings for people who are no longer alive, and the people who presumably would be jailed for their murders. $65 million in fewer policing costs, over $200 million in fewer corrections costs. And another finding which we thought was really important, based on research done by the Center for American Progress, who found that when you have additional homicides in the Chicago region, you see a reduction in property values. And so consequently, if we have fewer homicides, we would see the natural growth unimpeded to the tune of $6 billion.
That's awesome. That's really, and also this other thing about, I mean, it's kind of anecdotal, but you conclude that for every homicide that happened in a previous year, you can identify 70 people who decided, that's it, I'm out of here, they're leaving. So when you talk about our population decline, which is something that everybody's been writing about, you know, there is some speculation that it's like, well, I want to just get out of here because the place is so damn violent. Well, you've actually been able to dice that down into numbers.
And that's Stephen Levitt's research that shows the additional homicide leading to 70 people leaving out of the city. And we poached that for our study to our.
Is that Freakonomics?
It was a separate study that he done, but yeah, he's the author of Freakonomics. So you know, one of the major points that was a motivation for the study was to kind of get beyond the notion that living apart racially, living apart economically is an impact only to communities of color or only to poor communities. There's an impact to all of us, and we think the research shows that to some degree. The question now is, so what do we do about it? Right. And the second phase of our work involves outreach to a number of institutions, government, nonprofits alike, to talk exactly about that. And our hope is the early part of 2018, we will release a number of policy recommendations across a range of areas, from public safety, public health, public education, transportation, land use, so on and so forth, to answer that question. How do we fight the segregation, diminish the segregation, but also how do we deal with the inequality that we know inherently kind of results from that segregation?
I mean, one of the weirdest things about reading this stuff is that for those of us who've been talking about this for decades, there's almost nothing in it that's surprising. It's just that it's actually written down in black and white, that, you know, here's a number that you can associate with this. Here's another number that you can associate if you do this and this and this. And the numbers are even bigger than you might have expected they would be. So let's bring the police into this. We have a new Attorney General now, and the Attorney General is saying there's nothing wrong with Chicago that can't be fixed with just letting the police do their jobs. And Mick, you've reported on some very interesting stuff that's happening with police stops, and how police stops are, well, I mean, I don't want to get too far ahead in this, but you've written so well in the past on the contact cards stuff and how that got stopped, and the ACLU came in, and then the police kind of didn't make arrests for a long time. And now they're starting to make arrests again, but they're making arrests for, what is this called? It's called unlawful contact or something, right?
Right, exactly.
Explain.
Well, yes, everything you said was correct. What the most recent story I did was called guilt. We call it guilt by association, because people who are on parole are, and there's an increasing number of them, because in Illinois, as well as in many other places, there is a movement on the right and the left to try to reduce the number of people in prison. I think, very well intended. A lot of people, of course, looking at levels of incarceration in this country and saying they're absurdly high, the highest incarceration rates in the world.
And
so let's do something
disproportionate.
about it. Right. But there are all sorts of, while that is going on, there appears to be a almost complete lack of planning about how to release people into the community, giving people the means to succeed once they re-enter society, and giving the communities resources to do something about it. Of course, I don't have to tell anybody watching that Chicago has had this spike in violence, and the conversation, whether it's from the Attorney General of the United States or from elected officials here, whether it's people weighing in on the Sun-Times Facebook page, whatever, seems to be, what are the police doing about this? Police good, police bad, certain tactics good, certain tactics bad. I think the story I wrote is really just kind of a manifestation of that, where people are ignoring some of the things that Alden and his colleagues have been documenting and just making all these issues with segregation and all these issues with communities losing resources and population and crime spiking and reducing them to a police problem. So I say that because in fairness to the Chicago Police Department, they're under extraordinary pressure to do something about a very complicated set of problems. And they're doing what they've been trained and told to do, which is to step up policing. So my story was about how over the last few years there has been a spike in arrests for this law. If you're on parole, you're not supposed to associate with other gang members. Probably makes a lot of sense to people intuitively. So the police have been arresting, there's been a spike in these. Between like 2011 and 2013, there were a total number of arrests, fewer than 100 arrests for this offense total. And then
The offense of
unlawful contact with a street gang member while on parole.
while on parole.
Okay.
That is a real thing. That is a real law.
It's a real law.
Okay,
And so we went from like fewer than 100 total, it was like 7 arrests a year for a number of years, to several hundred arrests in 2014, a couple thousand arrests in 2015. It's dropped down a little bit the last couple years, but there's still several people a day being picked up for this under this law. And the issue with it is, what is it? Who is a gang member? You don't get a membership card to join a street gang. It's something that's defined entirely by the Chicago Police Department. People, out in some of these communities say any young African-American man from a certain block is considered to be a gang member by the police.
Just by your address.
Just by your address. And by the way, it's dangerous for a lot of these young men because sometimes they're considered members of the gang by rival gangs, whether they're involved or not. So that's a whole other form of peril that they face. So it's pretty vague who a gang member is, what qualifies you as a gang member under this law. And it's also just as vague and just as broad what unlawful contact is. So I looked at dozens of police reports and see people being stopped for walking down the street, sitting on a stoop, talking to a neighbor. No reason at all. I mean, broken taillights, all sorts of low-level kinds of things, and then they end up getting arrested for this particular offense and locked up for a couple days. And so I think the question is, is this just a law that's so open-ended that the police can basically stop anybody for anything? It's like the old gang loitering law, which was eventually found unconstitutional, or disorderly conduct. At one point in time, that was, I think that's now just a ticketable offense, but at one point in time, that was an arrestable offense. And these kinds of, sort of nuisance or association kinds of crimes, which are really open-ended, and they allow the police to sort of pick up whoever they want fundamentally. And again, I say there's a context, the police under pressure to do something about this, do something about this. So they're going into neighborhoods that are just flooded with people on parole, most of whom have very few resources to do anything to change their lives around, very little help to do that. And they can essentially be arrested for getting a ride with somebody or just talking with someone who lives down the street.
Okay, let's try to put all this into some kind of perspective here. I know, Alden, you and plenty of others have written in the past about broken windows, stop and frisk, and all of these other things that we've been so concerned about for so long. We appear to have abandoned some of those practices, but I get the impression that this unlawful contact thing is kind of like the newest, it's just the newest thing, right? I mean,
yeah, I mean, there's a very strong line that connects all of those policies, and I think it's safe to say that the intentions of that kind of approach are, I would say, mostly pure, because it is a response to a sense of there being heightened levels of concerns and incidents of crime and violence in certain neighborhoods, and in trying to address that, the police department and law enforcement in particular is trying to kind of get ahead of things. The problem becomes in the actual application and to some degree an understanding of maybe what's really at play that is leading to the violence. And we haven't yet figured out how to do that, and how to do that in a kind of fair and equitable manner. So the explosion of the the number of stops that were happening in Black Chicago were astounding. I mean, there were, in some of the reporting about that the ACLU did, and that some journalists have done also, showing how that was, I think over that one summer when the reports were out, and it blew away what had been seen in New York, which was probably like ground zero for that policy, and then at the dramatic reduction of that practice in New York at a time when there was also a reduction in crime and violence in New York. And to me, that should have been the sign to the law enforcement community that, maybe we don't quite have this right. That this sense that we have to be vigilant and we have to stop and we have to use every broken tail light or, wrong turn or what have you to investigate, that perhaps that is an overreach, and we need to be far more judicious about who we actually are suspicious of, and that without having a very strong filter on when we kind of exercise that power, it can run amok. And I think we've seen that not just in the application of stop and frisk, but I think we've seen that in our law enforcement activities, particularly in communities of color, particularly in low-income communities, for decades. I mean, we should have learned that lesson by now. And my hope was that the experience of New York with stop and frisk would have given another moment of pause to think it through, but apparently not. And so while we've cut down on the stops here locally, it appears that we're still to some degree in that mindset that we have to be ultra vigilant and use every avenue that we can in order to do that. The problem is that we haven't figured out how yet to do that, like I said, in a fair and equitable manner.
Right, and in a productive manner. I mean, I did a story a couple months ago about stop and frisk, looking at the numbers after the ACLU agreement went into effect, and it was like 3% of the people who were stopped and frisked were found to be with weapons. And so, there were two arguments or justifications to this. One is you want to find illegal guns. And that number alone shows that wasn't happening. They weren't 97% of the people you're stopping didn't have guns. So you weren't getting those guns through this approach. The other argument, of course, is that, well, it's a deterrent. So we may not, even if we don't catch someone with the gun, the word goes out, you can't walk around with a gun in Chicago. We're gonna get you at some point in time. But there's absolutely no evidence that deterrent has been in place. I mean, during this time, homicides and shootings have actually gone up. Right. So,
well, you guys have an interesting graph showing homicides going up at the same time that arrests are coming down.
Exactly, and that's not to suggest that more arrests means better policing and a reduction in crime, because as Alden alluded to, the New York City model has totally debunked that. They did cut way back on their stop and frisk program, under court order, I might add. And people were complaining about those orders and accusing the judge of tying the hands of police and everything. But crime has continued to drop in New York, and I think we have to be fair and say nobody really knows exactly why crime goes up and down. It's really complicated. There's a whole bunch of different ingredients, but the fact that some people want to tie it to policing and the aggressive kind of policing of making, countless stops a day in the same neighborhoods over and over again of the same people for whatever law you can find them to have potentially broken. It's just been debunked, I think, over and over by this evidence.
This is the question. When I read your stuff and I put it into context with the reports and everything, the question is why? Why does the Chicago Police Department feel that it needs to make all of these arrests for this parole association stuff? I mean, what are they thinking? What is making them believe that this will help them bring crime down? I don't see the connection. The dots don't connect to me.
Well, they're saying all the people that they're stopping for this are convicted felons, and they're keeping an eye on them, and it's a condition of their parole not to hang out with other gang members. And again, I think, all of us seem to be in agreement. Well, that kind of makes a certain level of sense. I mean, you're released early from prison with a set of conditions. You're supposed to kind of walk a straight and narrow path here. You got to keep your stuff together. And if you're veering from that path, well, we're gonna come in and let you know we're keeping an eye on you. That makes, I think that just is reasonable to a lot of people. But the problem is, again, as we keep saying over and over again, what does that mean? What is a gang member? A gang member, even if someone is in a gang, it's not the same as it was 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, it's not like, we're talking about these sharp dividing lines between, now you cross over this block, you're in somebody else's territory. It doesn't work like that. We hear this over and over again, the fragmentation of gangs, how fluid it is out on the street. And I should note that in these particular instances, a lot of times, the guys were picked up for having unlawful contact with someone who is supposedly in a different gang than theirs. So they're all hanging out. So I guess, they're not supposed to even have a peace summit with another gang member. I'm not saying that's what they all were, but you guys get my point. It's just like at a certain point in time, it just sounds like it's punishing the same people over and over again for having committed a crime for which they already served
for which
time.
They've paid their
right.
penalty.
Yeah, and to Mick's point about the complexity of this, there's whether it's criminologists, it's veteran police officers, no one has figured out exactly what it is that leads people to crime, or what it is in terms of effectively policing an area in order for that crime to fall back. The presumption, I think, that's perhaps categorically false, which I do think there is some level of understanding, is that policing is the answer to crime. And I'm not saying that it's not a part of the answer, but it is not the answer. There are a lot of things that go into people making very complex and challenged people making the decision to break the law, and having an officer present, whether there's a strong presence or a very scattered presence, is not necessarily going to change someone's decision to break the law. And then having the police kind of respond to that crime isn't necessarily going to stop that crime from happening. People aren't making the decisions to do these things solely on whether or not the police are going to come running, or if there's jail time or something like that. It's just it's a much more kind of nuanced and complex situation that leads people down this path.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where we can kind of circle back to Alden's study and the work that he's doing on segregation and the segregation of resources, not just the segregation of people, the segregation of resources. I mean, if we're going back a couple decades, really this kind of broken windows policing, this hot spot policing, this very aggressive whether you call it stop and frisk, or in Chicago it was police were supposed to fill out contact cards when they stop someone. They're supposed to get their name and their gang ID and all this kind of stuff. And the ACLU agreement, by the way, was put in place because they looked at a bunch of these contact cards and they found all sorts of nonsense in there. Mickey Mouse was the name down, and Mickey Mouse Club is the gang, and it's just like stuff that was just totally ridiculous. It was just not an adequate.
Because the police were being told they had to do
this, so it was like it was just a joke. I mean, some of it shouldn't be a joke, but it became a joke. So my point is that a couple decades ago, there was a political and largely politically driven and data-driven decision to invest police resources in these neighborhoods where there were crime problems. And this is the kind of policing we had. The police are doing what they're trained to do, which is stop and arrest people. And instead of making a conscious decision, well, we're going to invest different kinds of resources. We're just now talking in Chicago about mental health training for first responders, let alone having a wider array of services in these communities. We're still not really talking about significant kinds of job investments. I personally don't think it's a coincidence that as the parole population has gone up and the state budget crisis has resulted in zero spending for reentry services over the last 2 years. At the same time, we're having this crime spike. So what I'm saying is we have made a decision to invest in these communities. We've done it by investing in aggressive policing. So this is what we're getting, all these spikes and all these different kinds of numbers. Before it was people on parole, it was marijuana possession. Before that, I remember back when Alden and I were both at the Chicago Reporter, he was writing about I think gang loitering, and we were talking about
Were you guys both at the
conduct.
Reporter at the same time?
We were.
Yeah, for a number of years, actually.
Good old Community Renewal Society.
So this stuff just kind of keeps going around. The laws may change, but I think the tactics have been in place for a while, and a lot of people are asking the question: are there different kinds of investments we could make to get at some of these issues?
And to just re-ring the bell that I ring every single week at this table, when your clearance rate is somewhere between 3 and 20%, meaning the number of people that you actually arrest for these crimes, you're a part of the equation. I mean, there's just no way around that. The police department has an abysmal national record for apprehending people who even kill people, let alone just shoot people.
And there are a number of challenges the Chicago Police Department has, particularly with regard to misconduct and transparency. But even in making the point that they certainly in their performance is part of what needs to improve in order for us to get a handle on crime, to the point I was making that the police can't solely be what we think about in terms of addressing this crime problem. And I would say perhaps the job that the police are doing is perhaps better from what we can expect from the police than from the other aspects of government addressing the issues that are also contributing to the crime problem with regard to resources, with regard to education, with regard to the development of certain communities. The way the segregation, I think, plays into this is that it's funny, I was having a conversation with a number of folks at Bethel New Life over on the west side recently, and one of them in there mentioned to me that, we may not actively redline communities, but we know where the lines are, right? Of course. And we know where they are in terms of economic development, in terms of housing, in terms of policing and law enforcement, in terms of our social programs. We know those communities. You talked about that same map, right? Right. So if we know that and we respond to that and we characterize those communities in that way when we're thinking about investment, when we're thinking about the resources, when we're thinking about our programs and our policies, the approach that we take when we're on the street in those communities, we are just kind of, we are exacerbating the problem. I mean, we have to change the way we think about those communities, change the way we think about the values that are there, the assets that are there, the people that are there, before we can expect to see something different or expect our actions and our reactions to these communities to be different.
When you talk about, the police sort of outperforming what we expect because of what we asked them to do, it's the same thing with expecting our jail to be our mental health provider, right? Yeah. These are sort of like the default providers of services in certain communities, and it's shameful. I just want to mention, if you're listening to us on SoundCloud or on iTunes, or if you're watching us on TV, you're watching Chicago Newsroom or listening to it. Mick Dumke is here. He's with the Chicago Sun-Times, and Alden Loury is here, and Alden is with the Metropolitan Planning Council, has been for a couple months now, and doing some very good work, both of these guys, and I'm really happy to have them both on the show here today. I want to maybe change the subject a little bit. It's only a minor shift in focus because, Alden, you wrote a piece in, well, I don't know how, I still think of you as a journalist.
I do too.
You wrote a piece for the MPC website.
Exactly.
I guess that would be a way to
fine
put it.
publication.
A fine publication it is. About white flight from suburbs and what happens when a bunch of white people move out of a suburb and you go back and check a few years later and oh my God, all the jobs left the suburb too. So this is yet another manifestation of this kind of thing. But I want to talk about the suburbs. We don't talk about them very often here on our show because, you know, CAN TV is only seen inside the city of Chicago. Mm-hmm. But a lot of our folks have moved to the suburbs, and a lot of people are moving in and out of suburbs.
And your reach is worldwide, Ken.
Yes, through the World Wide Web.
Here. So yes, this is very important.
Yeah. Talk to me about this. What did you find?
Well, I was curious about, as part of our cost of segregation work, the demographic shifts that we know of very well within the boundaries of Chicago and the history of Chicago, and that those things are happening out in the suburbs now. And maybe not perhaps as quickly or as dramatically, but they are happening. Mm-hmm. And so just kind of playing around with the numbers and trying to understand where the demographic shifts have occurred, and then a light bulb went off in terms of, well, when we see that change happen, what might we see after that?
Right.
And so population loss and job loss are two, I think, kind of critical indicators of growth, of vitality. If you're losing people and you're losing jobs, you're going to have a hard time making a selling point for more people and more jobs to come to your community. And consequently, the flip side of that, if you are seeing growth in those areas, you have an easier argument to make. So took a look at census data that showed where white population loss was occurring, and I was also curious, well, what else is happening in those places? And what I found was that, generally speaking, places that were seeing a loss of white population were also seeing a loss of jobs in the subsequent years. So 2000 to 2010, the population loss, and then from 2010 to 2016, using a different set of data from the Illinois Department of Employment and Security, which showed that a number of those communities, regardless of their demographic makeup, which I found interesting, it was more pronounced in majority Black and majority Latino suburbs, but even in majority white suburbs, when there was a significant amount of white population loss, you did see some level of job loss, though not nearly as much or as often as you did in the majority Black and majority Latino suburbs. And particularly for the Southland, I think this is a very perplexing dilemma to really grapple with, because to me, those communities from the 1990s to 2000s and the 2010s now are experiencing what Black communities on the south and west sides of Chicago went through in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. As those communities changed over from mostly white, I mean nearly all white, to nearly all Black, in the suburbs it's not quite as dramatic, but they are experiencing demographic shifts as well. And are they able to maintain their economic vitality? Right. And the population growth and job growth were proxies to me for that. And I think the question is that as these communities are changing over, it is becoming much more difficult for those communities to be able to make a case. When you add into the demographic situation the fact that the property tax rates are extremely high out there.
Absolutely.
And that is one of the main things that those communities mention when they talk about how difficult it is to bring investment to their community, how difficult it is to retain population and bring additional people there. But that demographic shift, I think, is also a part of the equation, which they can't really help. I mean, Calumet City is now a Black community, but the fact that it is a Black community is going to carry some consequence. And it's not fair, but it is the reality that we live in. The same thing you could say about neighborhoods like Auburn Gresham or North Lawndale, that when they were majority white, they had a certain character and vitality to them. But when they became all Black, even when the all Black was relatively middle class, it became much harder for those communities to make a case for people outside of those communities to visit, to shop there, even to travel through there, and it made it much more difficult for them to bring investment in. And that, to me, is the real crime with regard to this issue of segregation, because when communities gain a character, in terms of their racial identity, it then seems to carry other aspects or other characteristics which may not necessarily be true.
You know, this is such an interesting and fascinating comparison to the 50s and the white flight and that kind of thing. Because now, I don't know if what I believe is fact here, but certainly I think anecdotally we all believe that in the last decade or so, Chicago lost a lot of its black population. Some of it just moved out of state, but lots and lots and lots of people just did what white people were doing in the 50s, and they just said, screw this, I'm out of here. I'm going to a suburb, a nice suburb, and I'm going to buy a house in the suburbs. So it seems to me that that dynamic was a little bit different than what we saw a generation ago, because you had people who had enough means to go to Calumet City or wherever, in 10 or 15 suburbs, and buy a house. And of course, we can get into the whole thing about 2008 and how all of us were victimized by that, and probably disproportionately there too. But nevertheless, you had people who had resources. They had the means to go to a place and buy a house. And as you say, this would seem, if you looked at it just strictly as a Martian, looking at the amount of money you have in the bank and everything, you'd say, well, that's just a kind of a normal turnover of a suburb. But it didn't work out that way. And the difference would seem to be race. The difference would seem to be prejudice.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think about places like Sauk Village and Olympia Fields and Hazel Crest and Calumet City, South Holland. You know, these were.
Dixmoor.
I wouldn't necessarily put Dixmoor in there, but those other places, and it's nothing. Don't at all mean to offend Dixmoor,
Yeah.
but those other places were viewed as Country Club Hills. I think
Country Club Hills, definitely. Yeah.
Those were seen as these black meccas, these places where black folks were aspiring to move to because they were in communities where perhaps things had changed somewhat, or people had moved up in their economic status,
Right.
and they were saying, "Hey, I want a big house. I want to go out to the suburbs.
Right.
There's a yard.
Yes,
Yeah. And
yeah.
so folks moved out
Maybe
there.
a better school.
Right.
Yeah, and so folks moved out there with the thought that, hey, life's going to be much better. And initially, things were great. And I still think that South Holland and Olympia Fields are still relatively strong places. Hazel Crest also. Flossmoor is another place I think where people flock to. But Country Club Hills is one that I think of. Calumet City is another place that I think of that have experienced some struggles. And I think a part of the reason why is because, again, as they became majority black places, that kind of carried a price tag with it. And even when characterizations about crime or characterizations about the economic situation of the people living there or about their ability to be a viable workforce, I think were probably, if people had the sense that those communities were no longer viable places because they were now majority black, I think they were missing the boat. But that is a part of that's who we've been. Not only in the Chicago region, but across this country, we have not been able to see majority black spaces as places of economic and educational talent or vitality, and that's part of what we need to fix in order to move forward and still have those spaces and still have some level of racial equality. But we also need to break that if we want those spaces to be places where people will feel, who are not black, feel like these are places where they can go and they can thrive. Because generally speaking, we see neighborhoods change from racially mixed or white to black, but we don't see the opposite. And that's part of this equation as well.
My colleagues and I went out to Calumet City and a bunch of other south suburbs last year. We were reporting on a series on Chicago Housing Authority, and we were talking to people out there because there were more people who had moved out who had some subsidized help for their rent and stuff like that. But talking to people in Calumet City in particular, I remember just this, really nice tree-lined street. The school is down the block, and talking to a woman who herself was disappointed. This is a senior African-American woman who had moved there 20-some years ago, and she liked the fact that it was an integrated community. That was something she had sought out after moving from a South Side neighborhood that where the integration had long ago disappeared. And she really liked that, and she was feeling very disappointed that it was disappearing from her block and from Calumet City all over again. And just lots of complex reasons why, like all the other stuff we're talking about. But it just really sticks out in my mind how that was something she had wanted. Not that it was like, oh, these white people are so great to live next to or anything, but just like it's just like it felt like it was it was a place where, hey, we could all live together, and now they're all leaving, and it just felt like something was slipping away.
Isn't this the essence of your report, that mixed communities are stronger than segregated communities? Unless you're white, I guess, but
Well, I mean, the presumption is that I think we can aspire to communities that are not as segregated as we are accustomed to here, and to be okay with that. That we can be okay with that. We can be okay with that from a social standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, and from an economic standpoint. We can. And the sad thing I think about the way that Calumet City has kind of gone is that I think there was a period where there was some stability there, particularly perhaps maybe in the 90s, as the community became more integrated. There was a lot of while there was a mixture of people of different racial groups, I think economically those were very similar people. And if there were people there who had been longtime residents who felt somewhat uneasy about their new black neighbors, I think they kind of misjudged who their new black neighbors were. They were people who were, coming from the same spaces in terms of being college educated, in terms of being professional people, being middle class. And if there could have been some stability, that could have continued on for a good deal of time, and I think the economics of the community would have remained strong and vibrant. The River Oaks Mall, and I wrote about this also, which is right there in Calumet City in Lansing, right next door. The interesting thing is that mall has fallen upon hard times, and here's the kind of insidious nature of segregation and how it impacts. So that community goes from a racially mixed community to a majority black community. That mall essentially transitions from a racially integrated mall to, for the most part, a black mall. I mean, that's who are the shoppers there. So it can't sustain itself economically because now you've got fewer people who are willing to shop there, fewer people who are willing to live there, and just market forces are going to dictate that that's going to be a harder place to have some success. And then you throw on top of that the squeezing the turnip dry in order to kind of get whatever resources they can from property taxes. Those things go up, and it becomes an even harder sell. It's almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy when people kind of give up on communities because they see that demographic change. And again, so one of my hopes is that if we stop and think, if we push the pause button when we see that those demographic shifts, perhaps we can prevent what has become an inevitable story for much of the South and West Sides, and now we're seeing in the South suburbs.
We seem to be picking on Calumet City here, but it's your fault. You started it.
And it's not to pick on Calumet City. I just think it's a great. I think it's a great example for us to really kind of look at.
It's a beautiful example. Well, I mean, to look at the numbers, and before we even get into that, I do want to say on your website with your report, there is a beautiful interactive map where you can just hover over every community and then see how its demographic change has occurred over the last 10 or 15 years. And the key number is the number of jobs per 1,000 people in the community. And it tells, it's just another one of those things where it's like it's the string theory of everything. You see that number, and that number tells you everything you need to know. Calumet City, white population from 2000 is down 63%. Jobs are down 29%, and now it's down to 160 jobs per 1,000 people living in that town. But my question is, what are these jobs? These places didn't have factories, right? They didn't have industrial centers. What were the jobs that went away?
Calumet City, and that is a next for me to kind of take a closer look at to figure out in what industries did the job loss occur. But what is left of what's in Calumet City at this current time is mostly retail, mostly food and accommodations, food service and accommodation, which are low-paying industries. Those are the two lowest-paying industries by average wages in the Chicago region. 60% of the jobs in Calumet City are those, and I think that's largely because of the mall and the shopping center there, and the retail jobs there, and that's not a growth sector in today's world. I mean, retail in and of itself is declining. It's low-paying to begin with, so that's another issue in and of itself. Even if there was job growth, you don't want that to be the basis of your job.
I guess what I'm getting at is there's an image that forms in my head of a bunch of white people packing their suitcases and loading up their trucks and leaving and taking their jobs with them. But it's not quite like that.
No, I think that would be a bit of a mischaracterization, because in most of these places, and I don't know the numbers precisely, but most people in these smaller suburban communities don't work necessarily where they live.
Right.
That percentage is going to be.
They've always been bedroom.
That percentage is going to be relatively small. So, but that is a question to take a look.
But what got me started?
There was industry though in the south suburbs.
Oh,
right?
sure,
I mean, there was quite a bit, and like everything else, the old industrial jobs have disappeared.
But those jobs were already gone by 2000.
They were gone, but I mean, the presumption was they were commuting to other places where there was jobs, and I don't know, were there people who once had government jobs in the city, and then as they retirees are leaving the city.
There's a story in itself right there. Government jobs. The government job sector is down so much certainly in Illinois and in Chicago. There are just fewer and fewer of those jobs. But I want to circle back for a minute, because you sparked something in my head when you said, let's take the example of the mall, right? Mm-hmm. The mall, this theoretical mall that had, it had 5,000 jobs at one point, because there were all these functioning stores, and every store had 100 employees. Well, that's probably too many, but thousands of jobs. And then when the demographic shift happens and the white people all run away, it's no longer an economically viable model, because you just don't have the audience there anymore. It's not even. Everything's about race, but it's not specifically about race. It's about the fact that the folks who are left can no longer support this entity, which has a lot of jobs in it. So the jobs begin to dwindle away. They're not going somewhere else. They're just kind of like poofing away. They're just disappearing.
Yeah, there's decline in the mall, because the places don't have the clientele to support themselves, and so they shut down, and the jobs that they supported are gone. But I would say that I do think there's more about race there than that. Certainly there's a market factor there. If there are fewer people who are shopping in that space, that's going to have some issues. But the interesting thing is that, and there are no numbers that I can show that will tell me this necessarily, but my hunch is that even before those folks had left Calumet City, they were no longer shopping at the River Oaks Shopping Center. Right. And what my hunch on that is my experience with what became known as Ever Black Plaza before it closed down. It was situated in Evergreen Park, which has been historically mostly white suburb, although it is less mostly white nowadays than it had been, and then surrounded in the city in terms of the Mount Greenwood and the Beverly neighborhoods. Mount Greenwood mostly white, and Beverly racially mixed, but for many decades it had been mostly white. And so white folks stopped shopping at Evergreen Plaza a long time ago. And so my hunch is that the segregation that we see in residential patterns, that we see in school patterns, we also see in consumer spaces. Another example there is a Red Lobster not far outside of Chicago Ridge. It's at Southwest Highway, 95th Street. It's the Red Lobster that I go to, because it's the only Red Lobster
your Red
on
Lobster.
the south side. You walk inside that Red Lobster, and you would swear you were in the heart of Black Chicago, because that's who the client base is. And so I think, again, it's very difficult. There are no census data sets in order to get that, but I think we see changes in consumer places that are based on race. And then we may see something that indicates that kind of change is happening in other numbers, but perhaps much later. And so the white flight that it may be happening in Calumet City, or has happened in Calumet City, I think is happening after perhaps the white flight was happening in that mall.
And you know, there is one other parallel with what we saw in the 60s and 70s too, where you know, these racial forces are at work at the same time there is a change in the greater marketplace and
the economy.
So, you know, the mill jobs disappeared
Very good
as
point.
these neighborhoods were integrated, and it sort of was a perfect storm. And as you noted, retail jobs are disappearing. I mean, there's this story about Starbucks is moving into the old Crate and Barrel space.
World's largest Starbucks.
On the Mag Mile. You can't any longer have this brick and mortar store for people to go buy their, you know, homewares because everybody gets that on Amazon or whatever now. So you're having a place where people can go watch their coffee roast before they drink it, and that's just a market shift.
Spend the day
and everybody's going to be glad that the space is used for something. But it strikes me as you're talking, Alden, this is the same kind of thing. It's like, you know, so the mall turns, you know, quote unquote, turns black. At the same time, like malls are not even as useful as they once were too. So this all kind of happened.
Everything's changing. You wrote, South Holland is the only majority black suburb and West Chicago the only mostly Latino suburb where both population and jobs have increased since 2010. Only two of them, South Holland and West Chicago. In contrast, 66 of the 102 majority white suburbs included, nearly 2 out of every 3 have seen both population and jobs increase since 2010.
Yes.
Yes, you did say that.
I did say that, yes. And I can't explain exactly why South Holland and West Chicago have kind of bucked the trend. South Holland, as I mentioned earlier, is I think one of those places that has been viewed, particularly among middle-class black folks, as a place to be. And so it has grown. It has been a destination point for a lot of black folks from the South Side and the West Side to a lesser degree, I imagine, for, I would say, maybe the past 20 or 30 years. And there was an opinion piece written by the Daily Southtown, which pointed out some of the kind of the bedside manner of the economic development activities that are taking place in South Holland, and how that may be part of the reason why they've been able to see some level of success when their neighbors, to some degree, are struggling. But you know, without having a really good sense of what's happening on the ground there, I couldn't say exactly what's happening there. Though the difference that you're seeing in those majority white communities, I think, does play into the fact that white spaces are viewed and seen as places to be, whether it's as from a residential side or from a commercial side. And so again, that it's kind of concluded my piece by saying we have to break the cycle of essentially economic vitality kind of following the movements of our white residents. We have to see that those aren't the only places that we should be looking at and saying, this is where I want to be.
It's a little bit of a switch in topic, but really it's the same topic in a way. You were quoted in a column in the Tribune a couple weeks ago talking about, this actually is, it sounds frivolous, but it's actually quite serious. What we've been talking about is you're running a little suburb. You've got, you know, 20,000, maybe 15,000, 20,000 people in your suburb. And it becomes less and less possible as the jobs disappear and economic vitality begins to drop. It becomes less and less possible just to keep your library open or to keep a fire station operating or however many police you need. And the only place you have to go is taxes, is property taxes. So there are suburbs, and the Crane Chicago piece used the term death spiral. There are suburbs that are just in a death spiral. They just will not be able to reverse this, not in our lifetimes anyway. And one of the things that was suggested, I don't know if it was suggested by you or you were quoted in it, but you suggested that maybe one of the things that should happen to some of these suburbs is they should just allow themselves to be annexed into Chicago. And then that would give Chicago's population a boost, and we could fend off Houston for another generation and remain number 3, which, you know.
The scenario was posed to me, and I did not suggest it, but yeah, Ted McClelland called, and I thought it was an interesting premise, you know, that if we want to grow, perhaps we should do what other places, because Houston is a place that has grown a lot by annexing land. It looks like a hot mess, though. I mean, it's not the kind of city that you would necessarily intentionally plan. But he proposed that as a potential avenue, and I said, well, if we were to annex some places, there are some places in the south suburbs that perhaps it would be a benefit to them to annex into a larger municipality like a Chicago, where the tax rate is much lower. Being a part of the city would open them up to services that they may not even be able to provide for themselves.
That's not something we're used to hearing, that Chicago has low taxes, but it's the lowest taxer in Cook County, basically, right? Yeah. And you pointed out that, well, I don't know, maybe this was Ted McClellan who pointed this out, I don't remember, but the suburbs where property taxes are double those of the city of Chicago, double Chicago's taxes, are Cicero, Stickney, Bridgeview, Bedford Park, Evergreen Park, Oak Lawn, Blue Island, Calumet Park, and Dolton, and there are others that are, similarly. So you'd have this interesting irony of people who, of all races and creeds, who left the city to go live in the suburbs and now face the possibility of going back or living in the same house but being in the city again.
And things, I think that for some of those communities, things aren't quite as dire as they are for places like Dalton, Riverdale's one place that Ted mentioned specifically, having a tax rate that was just.
He also suggested Evanston, Skokie, and Lincolnwood might want to join the parade and become part. And I mentioned before we went on the air that I just can't wait to go to that city council meeting up in Evanston to see the vote to have them subsume themselves south into the city. I just can't see it. But, it's something that creates a lot of humor in a lot of ways. But there are some serious ideas. We do have 1,298 municipalities in Illinois.
More than any other state in the nation.
Way more, right?
Yes.
Way more.
Yes.
So, it is time to maybe clean some of this up, and maybe some people should merge with each other. I mean, if they don't want to come to the city, maybe 5 or 6 of these suburbs could merge into one kind of Schaumburg sort of thing. I think
it's a very real scenario that some of these municipalities should consider, especially in the era that we're in now with regard to the problems with the state budget. There's some municipalities that are just hanging on by a shoestring.
We have to go. So I'm really glad we got to talk to both of you today. Thank you so much for being here. This is my favorite kind of conversation because, hey, you want to solve these problems? Jobs, right? Economic opportunity. It's not that hard. Well, it's hard to do, but it's not that hard to figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, we're always happy to lift everybody's spirits by documenting the problems in our metro region anytime.
That's what we do, right. Yeah, and we can really do. It's the Downer Show here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis. Thanking very much Alden Loury from the Metropolitan Planning Council for being with us today. Some good work you're doing over there, and I hope you'll continue doing it.
Appreciate that, Ken.
And you too, you're doing some good work over at the Sun-Times, Mick Dumke, and your little scrappy crew at the Sun-Times. Always glad to have you guys on.
Thank you.
And you do some very good work too. And you are watching Chicago Newsroom. It is it's a production of CAN TV, and we are darn proud of that. Next week, it's going to be a real interesting show because we're bringing 3 of the education ladies to the table next week. So Lauren Fitzpatrick from your place and Becky Vivi and Sarah Karp. Oh boy, you'll want to watch that one. Thanks for watching. Gotta go. Running a little bit late. I'm Ken Davis. See you next week with another program. And don't forget, you can watch us anytime by going to this address and seeing our shows, all of them, all 350 of them. See ya. Thanks. Bye.